Hey guys, welcome back to the channel, and in this video I'm going to show you how you can turn this almighty mess into this. I've been photographing and stacking lightning for over 12 years, and there's one mistake I often see that ruins most composites. Lighten mode. If you're using it, you could very well be creating artifacts you don't even realize are there. Today, I'm going to show you exactly what's going wrong with most lightning stacks, why it happens, and most importantly, how to fix it using a two-stage luminosity mask technique that will completely transform your results. You know, there's something profound about chasing and capturing lightning. You know, you're documenting one of nature's most powerful and fleeting phenomena. You know, moments that exist for milliseconds and are never repeated exactly the same way twice, but, you know, are recorded forever. And honestly, getting back to the studio to review what I've captured never gets old. It's like opening a present. You know there's lightning in there, but you never quite know what you've got until you see it on the big screen. I've been chasing storms for almost 20 years, and in that time I've processed hundreds, if not thousands of lightning frames, and I've developed a workflow that consistently produces clean, natural looking composites. So let's start by looking at what the problem actually is. Now, I'm deliberately using a pretty extreme example here to illustrate the point. A more typical scenario would look something like this, where the artifacting is less noticeable to the untrained eye. But what exactly is going wrong here? First of all, you can see that simply using Lighten Mode on all your frames just isn't a good idea. Even in this relatively simple example where the lightning was striking pretty close and outside of the precip, you still get these unnatural looking halo artifacts around the lightning strikes. This strange discoloration here, for example, that's data from this layer that's still bleeding through. This colour contamination is especially noticeable between frames when strikes with different colour temperatures overlap each other due to striking inside, outside and above the precip. See how these bolts are clashing with each other as they glow a variety of different tones from striking through different areas of a very hazy and precip-laden boundary layer. These also collide with the much cooler tones of the cloud background, and because of all this you inevitably lose your natural sky gradients. Lighten Mode ends up creating these unnatural patches and breaks in that gradient because it's simply grabbing the brightest pixels from multiple frames. This, of course, all adds up to an image that just looks obviously processed. It isn't natural, and it certainly isn't what you'd see with your own eyes during the storm. Now here's the thing, this isn't entirely Photoshop's fault. To understand why Lighten Mode creates these problems, we need to talk about what's actually happening in the atmosphere when you're shooting. So why do different frames in your lightning sequence look so different in the first place? It all comes down to what's between you and the lightning strike. When lightning travels through clear air, no rain, minimal haze, you tend to get this crisp blue-white colour. The light isn't being scattered or filtered by anything, so you're seeing the true colour temperature of the electrical discharge. But when that same lightning strike passes through a curtain of rain, for example, it's a completely different story. The light scatters through all those water droplets, it blooms out, and you get these warmer, more diffused tones. And then you've got atmospheric haze, particularly the boundary layer. Lightning striking through thick haze or low levels of the atmosphere filled with dust picks up this kind of murky, desaturated quality. The contrast drops, the colours shift, and the whole strike just looks softer. So, in a single lightning sequence, sometimes over just a few minutes, you're capturing strikes with wildly different colour temperatures, different levels of contrast, different amounts of bloom, different levels of diffusion. Every frame is unique because the atmospheric conditions between you and each strike are unique. But it's not just what's between you and the strike. The storm itself is constantly evolving. The cloud base lowers, the storm structure changes, the density of the rain increases. And if you're shooting at dusk, you've got that ambient light fading throughout your entire sequence as well. Basically, the entire environment is in flux. And this is why Lighten Mode creates such a mess. It's trying to combine frames that have fundamentally different colour and luminosity characteristics. To understand exactly how it goes wrong, we need to look at what Lighten Mode is actually doing under the hood. Lighten Mode seems like the obvious choice for stacking lightning. I mean, lightning is bright, sky is dark, so just keep the bright stuff, right? To demonstrate how it works as simply as possible, I'm just going to take the top and bottom layers from this stack and zoom in right to the pixel level. Photoshop goes pixel by pixel, comparing the same position across every layer on your stack. For each pixel location, it looks at the brightness value of every pixel in every layer and keeps whichever pixel is brightest. So let's say this pixel here in the top layer has a brightness value of 89%. And the corresponding pixel in the layer below has a brightness value of 35%. Photoshop displays the brighter of the two pixels. Now, if I add a curves adjustment to this top layer and darken some of those pixels, namely this lavender coloured glow, look how they disappear to reveal what are now the brighter pixels of the cloud in the layer beneath. And for the lightning bolt itself, this works perfectly. The strike is the brightest thing in the frame, so Lighten Mode just grabs it. Job done. But here's the problem. It doesn't only grab the lightning, it grabs everything that's brighter. If we refer back to this top frame again, where lightning is blooming out slightly through some very faint precip, and it's casting these pale lavender tones, Lighten Mode doesn't care that those lavender tones don't belong in your final image. If those pixels are brighter than the corresponding pixels in your underlying frames, even slightly, they get pulled in. Lighten Mode obviously has no concept of this pixel is lightning versus this pixel is unwanted contamination. It just blindly keeps the brightest value at every position. And when you're combining frames with different atmospheric conditions, different color temperatures, different levels of noise and bloom, all those tiny variations add up to, well, this mess basically. So now you understand why those halos appear, why you get color contamination, why the gradients break down. Lighten Mode is doing exactly what it's designed to do. It's just not designed to be used on its own for this kind of work. So what's the solution? We're still going to use Lighten Mode. It's perfect for grabbing the lightning itself, but we need a way to control where it grabs from and what it's allowed to pull in. And that's where Luminosity Masks come in. Here's the concept. We're still using Lighten Mode to blend our lightning strikes, but we're controlling it with Luminosity Masks. Now, if you're not familiar with Luminosity Masks, they're basically selections based on the brightness values in your image. Instead of selecting an object or area manually, which would be an absolute nightmare in and of itself, you're creating a mask that targets specific tonal ranges, so you can isolate just the brightest parts of your frame, like lightning strikes, while leaving everything else protected. And in this tutorial, these masks do two important jobs. First, they minimize the spill. They control where Lighten Mode is allowed to affect the image, basically keeping it focused on the actual lightning strikes and reducing how much of that contamination bleeds through. But here's the thing, they don't eliminate artifacts completely. So second, we use those same masks to selectively color correct any remaining spill or halos or contamination that still make it through. It's a two-stage process, contain the problem and then correct what's left. Let me show you how this works in practice. I'm going to take this old Brighton Skyline series I shot way back in 2019 and I want to expand the composition to include some cloud canopy strikes that I originally cropped out. We'll stack everything properly and you'll see exactly how to create these masks and use them for both containment and correction. Now, I use Limentia by Greg Benz to create my Luminosity masks, and although I'm using the full paid for version, there's nothing I'm going to be doing here that can't be achieved in the free version that he offers. So this is the full sequence, and I've gone through and given each frame a quick development pass just to help you visualize a few things to you here. And the first thing to note is the changes in colour temperature across strikes, not only from frame to frame, but also across the duration of individual strikes. If we take this frame here, for example, you can see the CG strike at the bottom of the frame has a very distinct warmer tone, whereas the intercloud strike towards the top of this frame is that much cooler. Secondly, note the difference in luminosity levels, again not only from frame to frame but also across individual strikes within certain frames. A CG strike behind, through and then emerge from the precip. And then thirdly, note the encroaching cloud layer overhead here and the casual scud that's just floating through the sequence. All of these elements need to factor into your planning and development here and show why you shouldn't just stack all your frames together, hit Lighten Mode and then call it done. Any heavy lifting will be done later in Photoshop once I feel I've got the composition balanced, but right now I just want to pick an image that has no strikes in it and has a fairly uniform sky backdrop and has an even light distribution to it. So, you know, nothing blotchy like this one here where there's obviously lightning striking behind the rain. So I'm thinking maybe this very last empty frame, there's no strikes in it, the only illumination is the ambient from the brightened skyline, and the majority of that encroaching cloud canopy has disappeared, so this will make a good base layer on top of which I'll composite all the other frames with strikes in them. The reason for this is simply that if I choose a base layer that has an area of bloom in it, then that bloom will conflict with another frame that contains a lightning strike in that same area, because the luminance values of that underlying frame will impact and obfuscate the frame I'm trying to comp in. Okay, so this is the composition I've settled on. It feels nice and even, it isn't too cluttered, and those spills should be relatively easy to clean up. I've dropped about 15 frames with a few I'm still undecided on, and whether I keep those frames or not will depend on how successfully they blend together. This dominant strike to the right of the frame, for example, may well have to make way for fainter ones behind it. Now it's time for the real meat and potatoes. We now need to blend all of this together. I won't take you through the processing of every single layer because we'll be here all year, but let's just tackle the first few so you can understand the concept. The beauty of modern luminosity mask applications such as Lumengia is in their real-time versatility, so with the click of a button you can see in real time which areas of your image are going to be affected, and then you can fine-tune that selection to suit. Now, the luminosity mask you choose for each strike will obviously determine the look of the final image, i.e. do you go for a wider gamut that takes in a lot of the light spill, or do you go for a much tighter one that might only include the bolt itself? In this instance, I need to select quite a wide gamut because I want to include elements of the precip. In stacks with less colour and light contamination, there's obviously a lot less to wrangle, but now in this situation we're essentially trying to control how much light bloom from each strike makes it into the final image. Okay, so now let's turn off all the layers except the base layer. We'll then turn on each individual layer one by one as we develop them. Now, it's important to note that each layer must be set back to normal mode when generating the luminosity mask for that layer, as you only want that particular layer's luminance information and not the entire image of combined layers as a whole. You might find that there's a lot of toing and froing at this stage, as some strikes will have more bloom about them than others and become overpowering, not so much in terms of spill or contamination, but in terms of how much screen space they dominate, so you might have to wind some of that in. Because Lighten Mode will help to eliminate a lot of the darker pixels anyway, there's really need to be so ruthless when it comes to selecting and adjusting your luminosity mask, so a basic light selection here will almost always suffice. Once you've applied the mask, you can select it and adjust it further by pressing either Ctrl L for a levels adjustment or Ctrl M for a curves adjustment, whichever you prefer, and adjust it further that way. Be aware though that this method is destructive, and if you don't like the final result you can simply delete the mask, come back up to the Lumengia panel and apply a different one that is more to your liking. If you find that the actual layer itself is still either too bright or too dark, then you can select it, move over to your adjustments panel and add either a levels or a curves adjustment. This adds that adjustment above your selected layer. Come over to the properties panel for that adjustment layer and click the effect layer button. This clips the adjustment layer to the layer below it, so that it only affects the layer and not the rest of the image. Then hold down Alt on Windows or Option on a Mac and drag that layer mask onto the adjustment layer, and voila, adjust to your heart's content. But beware that doing so will affect the overall hue of the layer you're adjusting. Just remember to group everything together accordingly to keep things organised, as the layers panel can quickly become confusing. Already this is looking so much better, so I'm going to go ahead now and finish this off, and I'll rejoin you when it comes down to colouring. You can see just how much of the heavy lifting that the Luminosity Masks are doing here. If I show you the before image and then compare it to where we're at now, you can see just how much cleaner and more natural looking the image is. There is still some very subtle banding between luminance areas, but this can easily be sorted and unified into a more cohesive whole by adjusting the masks as described before. Issues with colour spill are a lot less noticeable, though if I zoom out, you can see overall variations across the strikes. There is some noticeable banding, especially here on the left and to a lesser extent with these strikes on the right, but overall this is such a vast improvement. If I select this layer and disable its mask on and off, you can immediately see the impact the Luminosity Mask has in reducing that light spill and colour contamination. There is, however, a lot of colour spill and contamination when I turn on the layer for the big lightning crawler to the top right. This may in fact necessitate actually going in and painting out areas of the mask manually. Eventually, I had to go in and combine 3 separate Luminosity Masks to get this anvil crawler under control, mainly because this area here was blowing out the tops of these strikes to the right hand side. It's not a perfect solution, and you know, if I'm being honest, I don't think the inclusion of this strike works as much as I was hoping. The image has now lost some of its depth. That being said, you know, let's start colour correcting and see if we can't reinvigorate the image that way. And the Luminosity Masks have helped suppress some of the colour differences, but there's still some subtle colour variations across these strikes along the bottom. So let's add a hue saturation adjustment layer above the layer you want to affect and clip it to that layer, either by clicking this button here as shown earlier, or holding down Alt as you hover your mouse pointer between the 2 layers and clicking when this icon appears. By clipping the adjustment layer in this manner, it affects the mask from the layer you're intending to adjust, so you don't really have to copy paste the mask across to it. You can then adjust the hue and saturation to match. With this strike, I can see there's a lot more of a red cast to the bloom around the strike, so I click the red swatch in the hue properties panel and desaturate it until it matches the neighbouring strike. I'll quickly go through now and adjust the rest. With that done, I want to finalise the image by creating a temperature-based tonal contrast between the seafront in the foreground and the strikes in the background. Right now it feels like there's no separation between the two because they're both sharing those same warmer tones. Now, obviously the warmer tones of the strikes are occurring naturally due to the diffraction from the precip, but psychologically that doesn't work, as traditionally we tend to perceive lightning as being more blue in colour, and for something that is both menacing and threatening, there needs to be that sense of separation both literally and figuratively. And the easiest way to do that is, you've guessed it, with a Luminosity Mask. First thing I'm going to do is come up to the select menu and then select sky, and I'm going to apply that to a colour and vibrance adjustment layer. I'll then click that mask and invert it. I can now just alter the colour temperature of the foreground a touch. Now, there are many ways to skin a cat, and in order to cool off those background tones, I can either use a colour and vibrance layer and alter the temperature slider again, use a photo filter adjustment, or use a hue saturation adjustment, or a combination thereof. In this instance, I'm going to apply a colour and vibrance and set the colour temperature to -12. On top of that, I'm going to apply a photo filter adjustment, and I'm going to use cooling filter number 82 and set the opacity of that layer to 36%. Copy and invert the mask from the warm colour correction to the cool colour correction to assure it's only affecting the sky. I'm then going to use one of the zonal luminosity masks, in this case C, to select the light areas around each of the strikes, and I'm going to apply that to the photo filter adjustment layer. And finally, just to unify things, I'm going to select a suitable dark luminosity mask and apply it to a levels adjustment, just to add a bit of much needed punch to the overall look of the sky. So what have we achieved here? In just a few short clicks, we now have a vastly improved image that, given the versatility of luminosity masks, can be improved even further. This is what proper lightning stacking looks like. It takes more than just hitting Lighten Mode and calling it done, but the results speak for themselves. That lightning background now has smooth natural gradients with no ugly patches or breaks in tone. The lightning strikes themselves are clean, no artifacting or unnatural halos, no colour contamination bleeding in from other frames. It all feels cohesive with a sense of depth and three-dimensionality. Sadly though, this crawler at the top of the image just didn't work for me in the end. Ironically, with no pre-sub or cloud detail to anchor it to the scene, it feels like a lightning strike comped in from a different storm. What do you think? Should I get rid of it and stick with the original landscape format? What would you do? Let me know in the comments. If you want to practice this technique yourself, I've made the full raw sequence from this tutorial available to my Patreon supporters, along with a Photoshop file that includes all the luminosity masks so you can see exactly how the image was put together. You'll also get access to an extended cut of this workflow with an extra 10 minutes or so of footage which goes into some frame preparation and compositional considerations. If you found this tutorial helpful, do let me know in the comments, and if you're still struggling with any part of the process, drop your questions below where every comment will be read. Cheers, and until next time, thanks for being here.